But we will be going to questions from the audience here in Adelaide. If you have a question, we'll get you to raise your hand and we will get a microphone over to you and a camera on you because people are following this discussion online. And if you're following online and you wish to raise a question, if you can put it through the Twitter feed, we'll pick it up and we'll do our best to answer your questions. I'm coming from a background in the natural sciences. I'm particularly struck by the terminology that you've been using about developing an innovation ecosystem. You know, it's not as if you've been brought in as the innovation plumber to unblock the pipeline. It's a completely different, more organic approach. But my question to you is, if you're going to build an ecosystem, where is that ecosystem going to be based? Where do you need to be doing your work? Is it the boardroom? Is it the shop floor? Is it the laboratory? Is it government?
Well, all of the above. All of the above. So ecosystem, I guess, is a little bit of a throwaway, but we've seen it, smaller ecosystems. For example, if you take the accelerator incubator phenomenon in the startup world, in Silicon Valley, in Tel Aviv, in Berlin, Hong Kong, Sydney, Melbourne, Adelaide, elsewhere, you do see that when people get together and can share ideas, can share ambitions, can get access to basic knowledge about, in that case, how do you set up a company, what's the tax rules, where can I get some basic finance, introduce me to a high net worth investor who can not only give me some money but sit on my board, have some skin in the game and help. You can see in those sorts of ecosystems, a startup ecosystem creates its own energy. It's almost like a fermenting process. How can we, and then if you look further down the track, I think precincts like cancer centres where you get researchers, clinicians, patients, nurses into a physically proximate situation, you can get some translation that you wouldn't have, translation of new things, whether it's turning the patient over to the left before you jab them in the backside or whatever, or whether it's a brand new device or way of coming up with a treatment, you get that 1 + 1 = something bigger than 2. And what we haven't been getting, and what I was alluding to in the speech, is that I think our research, our basic research work in the sciences has just been a phenomenal success for Australia. Number of Nobels as one test. And, you know, we owe it to that investment and to those people and to their future that we have just as sophisticated next step of taking some of that, a lot of it, and getting it into the marketplace, getting into the community, getting into people's lifestyles and benefits worldwide, not just Australia. So it's that grand ecosystem that I've got in my head, other people have got in their heads about what else can Australia do to achieve that.
Do we also need to broaden our understanding of what innovation is? A lot of the discussion at the moment is centred around commercialising scientific research, but there's a whole area of science, in fact several areas of science, that aren't geared to doing that, but that the innovations that come from them teach us how to manage the environment, for example. Should we look at that as part of the innovation process, and how do we bring that into the conversation?
Well, I think you have to look at that. I guess for Innovation Australia and the sort of mandate that I've been asked to participate in, if you will, innovation is pretty much code word for how do we commercialise, how do we get stuff out there in the marketplace, how do we make a buck out of it, export it, make a profit and so on. But of course innovation, and you are right, in the whole not-for-profit sector and the whole community is all about better ways of doing things, new ways of thinking, not necessarily savings but improvements. And so I wouldn't like to annoy others who have that pursuit, which is so important, and we don't do enough of that either. But I think the not-for-profit sector is actually doing pretty darn well, and may in many senses be leading the way. Getting philanthropists, business, charities, not-for-profit organisations is getting there.
And a classic roadblock between science and commercialisation, that innovation pathway, is that science and business talk different languages. Do you feel comfortable walking into a laboratory and talking about the science?
Oh, I know all about the No, I must say, I had, from my experience, which was about 12 years at the Garvan Institute of Medical Research, I've been a voyeur on the sciences of biotech and genetics, etc. And I've learned a lot, and I know, the more I've learned, I realise how little I know. But it's very exciting, and I've got a sense, if you will, but the languages are different, to your question. And it's very different by sector. You know, I think if you're in the world of software engineering and coding and talking about a business model that's going to get through a digital channel to international markets next week, there's a different discussion than the guy who's got a brand new, new product that he's got to demonstrate, and it's going to be physically exported, and he's got to find a physical distribution and set of marketing people around new markets. You know, it's a whole other language. As between scientist and business and businessman, I think of Avi Hassan, the chief scientist of Israel, explaining to me in their universities, and there's fewer than here, and they're closer than our great federation spread, so to some extent not as surprising, but nonetheless the rock stars, the gurus on campus are the entrepreneurs. They are basic scientists who are also chairmen of high-tech businesses. They have won awards not just for their science but for their export awards. They are the exemplars that the young students coming into campus, and a lot of them back from military service, etc., they are who they want to be. So they've somehow achieved, without diluting their basic science, an excitement and a language that's shared about the importance of getting it out into the marketplace, or a chunk of it. Paul, be clear, I do not want to see basic science take a step back. I'm talking about incremental activity. But nonetheless, I think without some regard for impacts, market impacts being one metric in how you think about allocating your dollars, governments do and others, without stepping up to that, we won't get the collaboration.
Now, with respect to the question of risk, which you've brought up several times in interviews and this morning, Australia doesn't have the corporate appetite for risk, and part of that you're saying is due to our insolvency laws. So what do we do there? Because you're not suggesting that we'd be allowed to trade insolvent. What can be done there from a government perspective or a regulatory perspective to free up and encourage risk taking?
Well, you're right. I don't think we should be going around trading insolvently and recklessly, clearly. I've been in hundreds of transactions as a venture capitalist over the years, and I have experienced that many times, that terrifying moment when you realise, boy, maybe the creditors are going to own this business, and I better watch, and we better watch, not only for their sake but all the stakeholders' case. What are you going to do about this? When do you move into a voluntary administration or a formal receivership? Because the laws are very, very intimidating. Maybe they should be, but I think that, for example, at the early stage startup area, you do have to think about how do you get people to bother to go on the boards of those companies. Why would you? If you're exposed personally for the hiccup, How do you manage that? Now, in America and other places, with certain volume tests, etc., the liability stays with the company and not the individuals per se, save for fraud, save for witting, duplicitous behaviour, etc. The Chapter 11 legislation might be looked at here as well as being relevant. But I think the bigger issue is, from big companies down, the appetite for risk per se. I think we do see a lot of risk-averse behaviour. Historically, you'd say, well, if you're in a small market economy and you're a long way away from any markets, pre-digital access anyway, you know, risk aversion is rational behaviour. And I think that's what we've inherited and that's what we've had. I think the digital age has released a lot of that, has changed some of that, but in the big boardrooms down, I think governance, regulatory, focus on regulatory requirements is actually more abundant than focus on, wow, where are the breakouts here? What new products can we sell?
Don't worry about it.
There you go.
That's gravity at work.
It's a liquidation.
Just to sort of carry that argument to the next step, though, when we're talking about innovation in a corporate setting around the boardroom, it's difficult. It's hard work. And in an economy like ours, as long as it's easier and less risky to dig stuff up and make money that way, isn't that kind of boardroom competition a drain on forcing boards to do the hard work, to become innovative, to adopt innovative practices?
Well, you may be right, but you also would know the answer if you don't. It's only a question of time before you die on the vine. So, but I don't think there is enough focus from the top. Chief executives, you know, a recent survey was pretty depressing when I read it, of chief executives don't think, of the 200 top listed companies, don't think they get much value from their board members. You know, if you make 3% a year growth, it's tick. And you know, who's in there thinking and pushing about, no, wait a minute, we've just got to get a whole new product suite here. We've got to have a whole new way of dealing with our competition and go for markets, new markets. I just don't think that there isn't enough of that rev turbo.
Which neatly brings us back to the question of an innovation ecosystem, an innovation environment, an innovation mindset that we need to foster. I'm sure that amongst our audience today there's some wise ideas and questions on exactly these points. If you could raise your hand and we'll get a microphone to you, and if we can just hold until we've got a camera on you so that the world can see who you are.
Yes, just, you know, a question. You said that in Israel, the guru of science and technology district of this innovation environment ecosystem is the entrepreneurs. They are the entrepreneurs. And everybody knows that in Germany, more or less 75% of the GERD is come from private sector. And we can see that also in China now, the 70% of the GERD is come from private sector. That means more than 200 billion of USA dollar for research is come from private sector. So in Australia, that is not working this way. 58% in North Australia, in South Australia is 49% of the GERD is come from the private sector. What is your thought about that? In other words, in which way we can increase the number of entrepreneurs, and in particular, the small medium enterprise, you know, to be involved in this innovation ecosystem.
And if I could add to that question, you might like to mention some of the activities that you already have in South Australia.
Thank you, Paul, for that opportunity. I'm not sure I've got the full thrust of the question, but I do think that again, it's a bisector. In Australia, it's going to be a bisector analysis and set of things we can do. You know, if you broadly take startups and you take the digital economy and you take web-based, internet-driven business models, I think we're already seeing at least in my time in venture capital, I've never seen more activity and more excitement and more happening, albeit it's in the major cities. I don't know how regional it's got yet, and that's probably no surprise. But in a sense, the innovation culture is a bottom-up. I'm optimistic about a bottom-up rather than a top-down answer. I think that the younger engineers, the number of young women that are actively really taking it on, etc., it's all good prospective examples to the rest of corporate Australia. I think it'll be actually more impactful than the top-down from corporate Australia. But corporate Australia will learn that and already has, I think, a reasonable start. But grabbing hold of entrepreneurial activities, you see the banks starting to invest in and embrace fintech solutions. Why? Because it's a threat if they don't, I guess. But so it's happening, and therefore I think if we can increase the supply of venture capital, increase the play of individual investors, improve the collaboration programs that government can impact, and everybody in this room can as well, we'll start to see the shift right through the systems.
Questions down here on table 2. We've got hang on just a moment, we'll get the camera on you now.
Thanks, Paul, and thank you, Bill. I'm David Cruikshanks-Boyd. In my current role, I'm National President of our Engineers Association, Engineers Australia, which represents over 100,000 engineers, a number of whom are obviously involved in innovation. We have a pretty strong influence on and link with the academic sector through our accreditation processes to all the engineering degrees around Australia. One of the things that we see is the problem that universities face with the metrics which drive their performance, particularly the performance of academics, which does not directly encourage collaboration. Do you see any evidence from your communications with the federal government that there will be changes to those metrics and drivers that might drive the process of collaboration? Because clearly that's one of our major constraints at the moment, is the weak collaboration.
Well, I agree with you. That is a clear weakness, and I do expect that the innovation statement is likely to have some things to say about that, and it is for them to do so. Thank you.
How hamstrung are you until this innovation statement's released? Well, I get the feeling you're bursting to say a lot, but you've got to hold back.
Well, you know, I, along with many others, have had the opportunity to input to this process. But I'm in Adelaide, and of course the Minister, Pine, he could be lurking anywhere. No.
His office is in the building next door, actually.
Oh, right. Well, it is a very important message and delivery that the Prime Minister and Minister Pine, I think, will do together, and I think they'll do a great job at it. Let me say that.
Is there another question from the floor? Down the front here. Table 3, I believe.
Good morning.
Hang on just a moment, we'll just get the camera on you. Off you go.
Good morning, Mr. Ferris. Emil Bolangaita from Carnegie Mellon University. I was struck by your presentation of Australian inventions and your remarks about the inadequacy of commercialization. And I wonder to what extent this has to do with the incentives structure. of our research institutions, and compared to other places that are clearly more innovative, you know, and collaborative. You mentioned Israel, and of course, you know, in the U.S., U.S. universities have a far more remarkable rate of commercialization with respect to the outputs of their scholars and scientists. So I wonder what are your thoughts in that respect, with respect to how incentives can play a role with respect to the public universities in Australia that are obviously funded by the government?
Well, I do think incentives are critical. I do think that researchers, scientists who are in that career for the science itself is fantastic and will continue and is really alive and well in this country. But great science and great commercialisation are not mutually exclusive, as Carnegie Mellon know. And the incentives for those that would bother and do want to get their stuff and be seen out in the marketplace and do want to be entrepreneurs, and bless them, do want to make some money, yeah, you need incentives in place. Not just in how you structure the allocation of funding, but at an individual level, what's in it for me and those around me that help. And so tax plays a big role, and there'll be more to be said about that. And you know, the CSIRO here, Commonwealth Serum Industrial Research Organisation, it's a university, although it doesn't have as many students. But you know, it surprises people that if you work there, you cannot have any interest in the intellectual property that you might have had breakthroughs in or developed. You would have to leave the organisation and then try and, you know, do a deal and get back into a biotech venture or whatever it is that you could put together. Now, the new guy running that, Larry Marshall, has come back to Australia and has spent a lot of time in Silicon Valley as a very successful entrepreneur. You'd have to bet there's going to be some change there, one would hope. But it's an example of a culture where, I think when I first came to the Garvan Institute, which was, you know, whatever, only 15 years ago, you know, it was sort of almost, you were soiled if you talked too much about getting this stuff out into the marketplace, new discoveries. It was, you know, a bit beneath you as a scientist to even be asked to think about that. Okay, but as I say, great science, great outcomes for health and other things in people's lives are not mutually exclusive. And we need to shift that needle, and you will need incentives. And I think that's not so hard to come up with.
Question up the back. Off you go.
Mr. Ferris, it's Jerry Corson here from Kane Lawyers. I've had the benefit of actually seeing some of the proposed legislation for the crowdfunding, but my question is more general. How hard are we making it for people to be innovative when our tax system and our regulation is so complex that your average entrepreneur can't understand it without getting formal advice and having to pay a lot of money at a stage where they can't actually afford it? Are there any solutions, do you think, to those issues?
Tax law, that sounds like a bundle of fun.
Yes, well, it's a good question because, you know, if you've got a startup, you don't necessarily want to go to New Zealand or to Silicon Valley to make your business a success. But you may find even with, say, you know, 8 employees, you've got all the occupational health and safety and paperwork that's involved in a much larger business. And you've got all the obligations as if you were employing 1,500 people, if you know what I mean. Of course you know what I mean. That's not easy to fix. I mean, we have a civil society and a very good one in this country that works, But yes, I think you do have to be able to accept a bias if you want to get some outcomes. And we've talked about insolvency at the very small level and the laws relating to that. I think crowdfunding, it's a great opportunity in theory to democratise public retail at public street level for getting involved in innovation and startups. Yes, on the other hand, are you prepared to do that without regulation, without some protection, without some mindfulness about fraud and other stuff? It's a tricky area. But your question is still the right one. I think you do have to make some allowances if you really want startups to have a crack at it and stay in Australia long enough to create the IP here and benefit from it.
Any further questions? Because you've been quoted as saying that companies should be given greater access to government data to experiment with. Are you having a chat with George Brandis? What exactly have you got in mind there?
Well, really, I think government big data, so we're talking about mega data and the data analytics that can algorithmically make stuff of that. State and federal governments have repositories of amazing stuff, not always on the same rail gauges, of course. And entrepreneurs with access to that sort of data, whether it be health records, whether it be de-identified data in health, in all sorts of services, in conveyancings and so on, can come up with new ways of doing business, new ways of providing services cheaper, etc. So access to big data and also having government departments think about not prescribed projects and grants for people as perhaps defining what the problems they have in their own departments, whatever they be, it defence or education, whatever, and putting out to tender who's got a solution. We've got $2 million here potentially for solving this. Well, please tender. So it can be that sort of access to data, but probably that comment was relating to the macro stuff.
And that feeds into the whole question around digital disruption. We don't talk about classic audiences anymore, or one audience. There is great subtlety in audiences. We don't talk about one market anymore, but very specific niche markets that we need to understand better. Yep. And so is that where you can see that there is room for entrepreneurs, if they have access to government data, to be able to identify what those markets are?
Yep. Yeah, definitely. I think NICTA, it's now called Data 61. 61's our postcode, right? And it's now part within CSIRO. I think it would already claim and have a lot of evidence of success in IT solutions dealing with government data and government problems, as well as other private sector problems. And I think, more of that's possible. I think government procurement, government access to government data, all of that we need to make more accessible.
And to take that to the next level, which does bring our conversation around back to something that we discussed or touched on earlier, there has been a push from leading figures in the tech sector to extend the mining sector's no liability corporate structure to technology startups to encourage experimentation. Is the no liability corporate structure of the mining industry something to be desired?
Did I write about that?
It was in an article discussing it.
I think I was listening. I can't remember saying anything. I'm trying to think what the analogy would be. For example, if you were an all equity funded miner doing exploration, that might be one thing. Or I can't believe, though, that there would be no liability relating to environmental risk and
no liability is in quotation marks. But anyway, so okay. Just to round off the conversation, a comment that you made that struck me was that want to back a push for greater emphasis on science, technology, engineering and maths, or STEM subjects in schools. But what caught me was that you qualified that and said that you warn against diluting the importance of liberal arts.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, I love life in Australia, and I love our balance. I love, I'm not going to grow up with a whole community of nerds. Not that I'm pointing the finger at STEM graduates as nerds. I know I'm in great company. You know what I mean. We've got to keep a balance, and I think if the educators thought that we're on the hunt to take money out of the liberal arts or something, that would be a disaster. I also have 3 children who are all sort of liberal arts people and creative people and Latin and Greek double honours people, and they would never talk to me again if that were to happen. We would be a lesser place, wouldn't we?
Oh, indeed. I couldn't agree more, even though I am firmly in the other camp.
Well, of course, we're all realists about if you're going to play in this digital world, the new technologies ahead, we need a certain number of students very excited about coding all over STEM subjects, and we don't have enough of that. We clearly do not have enough of that to make a fair share in these new businesses. So we have to.
I think we have another question from the floor. Yep, go ahead.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Mr. Ferris. I'm Abra Bhattacharjee from Scotch College, and so your request from the podium to really look at STEM is something we're very closely looking at. It also is not just looking at STEM, but also looking at design and looking at how that can come in, which also comes across the liberal arts area. I guess my question is something as somewhat of a new Australian or somebody that's come to the country somewhat recently. I hear you talk about ecosystems, and we've seen many models, whether it's in Tel Aviv or whether it's in Palo Alto. But there's also the basic need for some infrastructure. And some of the ecosystems that you were talking about were the university or the research ecosystems, the government. We've even heard about taxation and so on and so forth. But I'm completely stunned by the cost of broadband in Adelaide and the difficulty in getting it. What are some basic infrastructure things that you believe are going to be absolutely critical, walking perhaps before we can run?
Well, that's a big question. I mean, you're right. Infrastructure, back in where we're talking about early colonial innovators, the governments built the roads. They were the NBNs of those days, I guess, and so on. Here, in the health and medical research, again, a sector by sector sort of national bio libraries of tissue banks and electronic research information that can be accessible to researchers around the country and so on. These are all infrastructure projects beyond any one participant. I think government gets that. There are then, of course, some go to other sectors like big projects, be it you're going to find the quantum computing solution. Well, again, that's going to have to be national. Go from every sector, you'll find that. So governments have to play a big role in infrastructure, and they are better risk takers than the private sector anywhere in the world actually at doing that, I think. So they have to step up for that. And we may hear some more about that. Were you focused particularly on the STEM and the requirements for infrastructure to achieve something in STEM in the question, or?
Although you've been recommending a very sectoral approach to looking at innovation, the fact is that
I see what you mean.
Building blocks for any kind of innovation.
Yeah.
You've got to be able to connect with people. You've got to be able to have access to infrastructure. And while Paul Friedman will always, remind us that the world is flat, it's not flat enough.
Yeah, and I can't tell you, is broadband slower where you are than where I am in Sydney?
You can't get an exchange. In southern suburbs of Adelaide, the exchange is full, so you can't get a broadband connection. ADSL2 is only available in 42% of those suburbs.
I think you should drop a note to the Prime Minister.
Well, you'll be catching up with him soon. You can maybe have a word in his ear. Ladies and gentlemen, I think this morning we've heard the beginning of a very important conversation that this nation needs to have. And it's been an absolute thrill to meet Bill Ferris this morning. Would you please give him a big round of applause? Thank you.
Thanks, Paul. Thank you.